This is Battle Hymn from Compass Games, and as the box tells us, this is an exciting new series of Civil War battles from designer Eric Lee Smith. And that would be American Civil War, as opposed to all the others, as evidenced by the first two entries in the system, Gettysburg and Pea Ridge. I was a big ACW aficionado and gamer for quite a long time. Then I just sort of stopped. Taste changed. But in the last year or so, I've been trying to take a look at new games on the era that had a different take. My preferred game for a very long time was the Gamer's Civil War Brigade system. But that's very kind of complicated, very literal, time-intensive, and I wanted to look at games that were a little bit simpler, maybe a notch below. I think this one might fit that bill. This is a fully boxed game, kind of a big, hefty box. This is not an unboxing video. I'm going to try to take a closer look at this game and the system. But pretty, got some good stuff on it. But of course, after this, I will never look at it again because I never look at boxes and I don't make buying decisions based on the box. It has to be some more information to tempt me. This one, I'm led to believe, is kind of an extension or maybe the next generation of this designer's Across 5 April system that he did some years ago for another publisher. I don't know those games, but a read of the rules for this one, I think I got off the Compass Games website, really piqued my interest, and I thought I'd give this one a try. I think the thing that really caught my attention was the different way it handles the sequence of play and the interaction of movement and combat. It makes it very non-deterministic, so it adds an element of surprise and uncertainty that I think probably will play out pretty nicely. That said, I actually hesitated for some time before grabbing this one up because the combat system gave me a little bit of pause. Just in reading the rules, it felt like it was going to be really dice heavy. That was a bit off-putting to me. But after the game came out, got some traffic in the forums, reading some of the experiences and asking a question or two, I think I've allayed that concern. So I went ahead and picked this one up, and I'm going to tear into it and see what it's like. Okay, I already said this is not an unboxing video, but really, look at all the stuff you get. I mean, you have 2 games in one box, 2 maps, counters for both, player aid cards for both. There's a lot of stuff. It's a pretty good package for the money, really. I'm sure I read something about Pea Ridge that I have no longer any recollection of. But having lived in Northern Virginia for a while, I became far more familiar with the Eastern battlefield, so I'm going to start with the Gettysburg game here. So it's really a pretty good-sized map. Now, as happens with games of this size and scale, it's often limited to the historical area, not a lot of extra room for what-ifs, but apparently the designer is considering that as a possible add-on, so that could be something to look forward to, but this is the Gettysburg map, as it stands right now. It's pretty stylized. It has a very period feel to it. Looking at the credits here, it almost looks as if a cartographer of the age drew this up. I also kind of like this aspect of there's the playing area, but still parts of the cartography are present on the some of the non-play areas. So I think the general look of the map is pretty good. The feel of the ridge lines and the slopes and so on is strong and gives a good sense of the topography. One thing that's been mentioned, I think, on some forums is that this look of Cemetery Ridge is a little different than people maybe have experienced, having walked it themselves. What the designer said was he was going for an effect with this layout of the terrain. He wanted to demonstrate how hard it was to take these positions, and he accomplished that a little bit with this sort of snake-looking ridge there on that side of the field. And of course it has some of the typical features like the peach orchard represented here in the rocky area of Devil's Den. Plenty of charts and information on the map to kind of keep you focused, not having to refer to a lot of external play aids. This is a brigade scaled game, and these hexes represent about 300 yards of terrain. But one of the first things I noticed when I was looking at this game before I bought it was the time scale. I'm going to take a quick look at the P Ridge map. This is the turn track. See, the time scale is approximately 1 hour per turn. That way, across actually both days. Okay, 1 hour per turn. Now if I look at the Gettysburg, I see they're not 1 hour per turn. It's different. And that's the first day, and then we go on the second day, and it's different yet again. Now I'm at an hour and a half. And then the third day, different again, hour and 45 minutes. So I thought, what is going on? Sliding turn scale? Time scale? What is this guy doing? Well, before I could be confused, someone had asked the question, and the designer responded by saying, this is a simple way to demonstrate fatigue. Rather than having markers or charts or rosters you have to keep track of, he just shows in the time scale. So on the first day, you're relatively fresh. There's going to be more turns in the day than there are in the second day, where each turn occupies more time, therefore modeling your army moving more slowly. So you're exactly 15 minutes slower every day. That's, I think, a decent way to demonstrate how your army is showing its fatigue over the course of a pretty long and catastrophic 3-day battle. And it's definitely a sign of the design, the choices involved that focus on certain things and then abstract other things. I think this is a pretty decent abstraction. Now the rules themselves are divided into 2 books. The standard covers presumably every title in the system. Only weighs into 20 pages. Pretty well illustrated. So it's not like a densely packed rule system. So it's a slightly bit less complicated. Then it has a very generous special rule book that covers both the battles. And it's pretty, it's chock full of good stuff. Alternates, scenarios, what ifs, things like that. It's always good to see. Gives some replay value. And some very good setup information to make it very clear who starts where. I'm going to get some counters out and take a look at how it plays. I've become very fond of laser cut counters myself. These are pretty typical die cut. Standard thickness, a little bit larger size, a little bit larger hexagons in this map. So I think it'll be easy to handle on this size of the map. Sometimes I think a game is defined as much by what it's not about as what it is about. Designers, especially in games that are looking to be a little less complex, are going to choose a point of view they want to emphasize and make sure their mechanics and their systems present that. Sometimes that means explicit models, sometimes it's abstractly represented, sometimes it's just cut out altogether. I think in this game, before we get to what it is about, we're going to look at something that's kind of not about. And I think that is leadership. It really doesn't try to inject leadership specifically into the game system. And I'll see if I can try to explain that a little bit. First, a word on terminology. When I would look at a game like this, I'd see this little representation, I'd think, oh, that's the turn record track. But I would be mistaken in this game. This is referred to as the hour track. Each of these things is called an hour. Now, don't pay any attention, it's actually longer than an hour of time represented. This is terminology-wise, referred to as an hour. And within the scope of each of these units of measure, things will happen, of course. Those things are referred to as turns. So within each hour you can have any number of turns occurring, and those represent the activities taken by the players and the forces. There are move turns and combat turns. And they're represented by these chits, and you will throw these chits into a cup, and you'll pull them out randomly, and when you have a move turn or a combat turn, you undertake the activities associated with each. But the order of the moves or the combats, and there's going to be more than 2 of each, depending on the number of forces involved. But the order is just randomly determined by the pull from the cup. If I flip those move turn chits, I see specific information. For instance, looking at First Corps for the Union, Heath's division for the Confederates. So they represent specific units that would be moving. But while it has this information, 1 Corps, the nice badge, shoulder strap badge for the rank, Reynolds' name, has that color bar, has the 1 and the GB. Similarly for Heath here, it has his division, rank, color bar, the parent corps, and so on. Those things really don't matter. The only things that matter are that color bar and then the 1 and the GB. The color is going to group together the units that are associated with this move turn. The 1 is its hour of entry, and the GB just indicates the Gettysburg game. So taking a quick look at the units, all the same color corresponding to that move, representing the Union First Corps, all the brigades involved. And the same here for Heath. He's got his green bar indicating all the brigades of his division. And notice for the Federals, there are no division leaders here, only the Corps, because the Federals maneuver by corps, and for the Confederates, they maneuver by division, so they have their division leader. But there's no representation of A.P. Hill, the corps leader. There's also no representation of Robert E. Lee or George Meade, because the leadership is not really relevant. What's relevant is the unit of maneuver as represented by this counter. So the First Corps, the badge, Reynolds' name, those are just pretty to look at. They have nothing to do with the gameplay. So in effect, there is no leadership and there are no leaders involved. In a similar sense, there's no leadership represented by these counters either. Is Reynolds a more effective leader than Heath? Not really, because 1 chit goes in the cup for each of them. If Reynolds were a much better leader, maybe we'd have 5 chits in the cup to 2 for Heath, and that'd change the possibility of when you would roll or draw to move this formation. But they have equal weight and no representation of ability or effect is here. We know historically that Reynolds was killed, but that doesn't matter because really Reynolds is not this counter. This is just the move turn counter for the First Corps. Whoever's in command is kind of immaterial. So I think right away that tells you this is not a game about command. The groupings of formations are only there to control and randomize movement. And combat, of course, and that's actually a very key aspect of the game, when movement and combat happen in relation to each other. The overarching sequence of play is actually pretty simple, but the mechanism for enacting it is kind of interesting, and it has a very pronounced effect on how the game plays. So this is a war game. You move and you shoot and you try to win, right? But the sequence of movement in combat is not fixed. There is movement and there is combat, but you can't predict when it will happen. Basically, you place the chits in the cup that are currently available for units that are on the map or due to arrive as reinforcements. So we look at this, the typical opening of Gettysburg. you'll have Heath and Reynolds, more or less, in play on the first hour. I think even though the Federal cavalry is present, they're not permitted to move till the second hour. And you have the slow arrival of the reinforcements. So depending on which hour you're playing, you're going to have anywhere from 2 to 7 chits in your cup. And then you'll just draw them randomly. So if this is our cup and we drew randomly, and we drew Heath's marker, well, Heath would get the move, and you would move his forces. Now what if, instead, you drew a Confederate combat turn? Well, if you're not even on the map yet, or you're 10 hexes away, you have no one to engage in combat, so no combat for you. Go and draw the next chits. So you can't just move and then shoot the way, maybe we're kind of used to in many games, certainly of this era, of the more linear tactics. You move and then conduct your combat in the order in which they're pulled out of the cup. I wouldn't call that command. That's just a mechanism for taking the omniscient view and total control that the player usually enjoys away from them and forcing them to become a little more circumspect in their choices and their actions. So as a player, you still have omniscience and full control. You can intend to attack Seminary Ridge, coming from this direction, put your forces in place on the previous hour and then be ready to go in this current hour, and yet just pull your chits in a fashion that don't really support your goal. So that's the thing that thwarts you. Could be your opponent draws a chit first and they're able to counter you before you're able to pull off your maneuver. Could be you just pull your chits in a poor order. Doesn't facilitate what you want to do. So it's interesting. It makes for a fun game, but it doesn't really represent, like a problem in command specifically, explicitly. It's more abstract. But there's a wrinkle, pretty important wrinkle, kind of a powerful one as well. There's a notion of initiative. The scenario will determine which side has initiative, and that can change. And the initiative player actually pulls back their combat turn marker, keeps it out of the cup, and then they can decide when, before a pick occurs, if they want to initiate their combat turn. So you may have, either side can be initiative, of course, may have initiative. You may get a move and say, well, this is the perfect time to attack. Declare this is going to be your combat turn. Conduct that activity, and then it would go back to chit draws, finishing out the cup. Just a quick look at the counters. They're fairly typical. They have strength, morale, movement, and then branch, that's artillery, cross for the infantry. I think those little buttons along the coat there. And then the typical single cross for the cavalry, heightened movement. So you see this is the Iron Brigade, excellent morale. Brockenborough's brigade was, kind of poor, so they're -1. At first glance, these movement factors might seem really high, 8, and these hexes are 300 yards, so geez, what are you saying, 2,400 yards in 1 hour of time? Well, not really. The terrain costs are pretty high. Clear terrain costs 2 movement points. Forest costs 4, so it's expensive to move, and these high numbers kind of even out. Infantry movement in combat is pretty straightforward. We'll focus on movement here. You just pay your costs and you can enter zones of control and so on. Artillery is a little different. For movement, they're not able to enter a zone of control. And then for combat, they have either adjacent attacks or bombardment in range. Cavalry is probably the more complicated of the arms. For a game that strives for a little more simplicity, there's actually a little more detail surrounding how cavalry is handled, about when they can move and where, and also the notion of mounted or dismounted along with horse holders. So it seems like a lot of lot of goo to throw in there in a simpler game, but I think it's trying to strive to hit its mark with what it's focusing on, and that is really going to be around the strength of units and the attritional nature of the combat and the battle in general, and how that affects them over time. And the fact that cavalry has to behave differently, I think, will play into that particular point of view. So there's no reason to dwell on how movement works. You're in a hex, you pay your cost, you move, right? The units all have zones of control in all surrounding hexes, and those zones of control have fairly typical effects on movement. There's not really a facing per se at this scale, so of course zones of control are all around. But also in terms of stacking multiple units in a hex, that's a no-go. 1 unit per hex is all that's allowed. Now, a friendly unit can move through another friendly unit, but they can't end stacked together. There's one last kind of important aspect of movement, and that is the notion that whichever unit moves into the zone of control of another is going to kind of be flagged as moving, and the unit that was entered, whose zone of control was entered, will be shown as firing, and this is called approach fire. So this unit will have the first opportunity to fire on that unit and the combat turn occurs. If the sequence of play, activation, and movement are all pretty straightforward, then what do you spend your time on in this game? Sometimes it's the rules weight that can really give that away. In this case, those things, sequence of play and so on, are covered in a mere 6 pages. And the balance of the rule book, about 13 pages, is all given over to combat. So this is a combat game, very, very heavily focused on combat and then the things that are surrounding combat, like morale and retreat and rallying. Let's look at a hypothetical situation along McPherson's Ridge here, see how combat would work in this situation. This is the combat summary on the player aid card, and you see it's really not that complicated. The basic rules are units in contact must execute combat with everyone in contact. So when you're drawing chits and you're moving, you're coming into contact, first you keep track of who moved adjacent to whom, but when that combat chit is pulled, the side that owns the chit is considered the attacker and the other side is considered the defender. Since likely both sides will be able to pull their combat chit, each side will have a turn, just unsure when that'll happen. You can see there's opportunities to retreat before combat if you're cavalry. That would be a case where the defender is essentially performing a cavalry screen in front of non-cavalry forces so they can avoid combat with stronger infantry. Attacker can bombard with artillery at distance. Attacker can also sometimes retreat before combat begins. There's a special case called approach fire, which we'll get to after main combat, because it's basically just combat but with a few limitations. Once you get to the main aspect of combat, you're going to determine engagements. Generally speaking, an engagement consists of figuring out which adjacent enemy units will conduct a combat with which other units. So because all these units are within the ZOCs of each other, and this is the Confederate combat turn, they must attack both of these units. And the Confederate player can figure out how he wants to organize his engagements, which units he wants to attack which defenders. But all defenders must be attacked. Now when you get into bigger battles, bigger lines of infantry or forces and exerting ZOCs on each other, figuring out an engagement in this game can be about as hard as it is figuring it out in life. It can be a little tricky, but kind of use your best judgment to figure out which units really are involved in fighting each other and which are not. In the end, it's a game, so I wouldn't stress it. If one engagement determination determines winning or losing a game, that was probably a pretty fun game, so no harm. The rules suggest using engagement markers to mark your engagements. If there is such a thing in the counter mix, I can't find it. I have no idea what it is. But I'm sure you can probably use any old thing to indicate which units are combined in an engagement. I'll use my trusty tile spacers here. So I know Archer and Baxter, and then Pettigrew and Davis are combining on Paul. Now with that out of the way, you would resolve each engagement separately. Now an engagement consists of 1 or 2 combat rounds. A combat round is just fire combat between the opposing units in the engagement. Fire combat consists of 2 things, a fire resolution and a hit resolution. So fire resolution is a process of determining a hit number between the target and the firer, and then rolling dice to determine if hits are scored for that fire. Hit numbers are generally terrain-based. For instance, clear terrain has a 2-hit number of 5. Intervening terrain can potentially affect that. There are cases for surrounded effects for zones of control and special units and special terrain, things like that. But basically, you come up with a hit number, and then you roll dice equal to the current effective strength of the unit that's firing. So in this case, if Archer is going to fire on Baxter, he has 4 strength points. He has suffered no ill effects from combat so far. So he would roll 4 dice, 4 individual die. So if his hit number were 5, he has 4 strength points. He would roll 4 10-sided dice, and a hit is recorded for each die that is less than or equal to the hit number. So supposing Archer rolled his dice and he recorded 2 hits, he would throw a hit marker 2 on Baxter. Now this is a simultaneous exchange of fire. So then Baxter would determine his hit number, his effects, and potential modifiers to that hit number, which actually includes morale, that middle number. So he would roll his 5 dice. His hits don't affect him yet, and record any hits on Archer. And we'll say those Federals are really good marksmen. They record 3 hits. Now that's basically 1 combat round for that engagement. Well, not quite. Sorry, you have to then perform hit resolution. Hit resolution is basically a morale check to determine what effect those hits have on the target unit. Now the order of this is important. The defending side performs their morale check first, then the attacker. So the morale is a simple 10-sided die roll. Less than or equal to 5 is a fail. Greater than or equal to 6 is a pass. And then there's modifiers. For instance, the morale is added to that number to figure out pass or fail. So when resolving hits, if you pass your morale check, hits are turned into demoralizations. So suppose Archer passes his morale check, his 3 hits become 3 demoralizations. We'll get to what that is in a minute. Let's suppose Baxter fails his morale check. He would suffer 1 strength point loss and 1 demoralization. So the way the game has to record that is 5 becomes 4 strength points. The green is his total strength points. And then you'd have 1 demoralization. Now, the effective strength of that unit is now 3, because a demoralized strength point isn't effective. It's there, but it can't really fight. Similarly, for Archer, he really only has 1 effective strength point because he has 3 demoralized strength points. That's a little clumsy to me, my take on it anyway. But that's how they have you do it. I would probably play it this way. I'd want the green to show me how many strength points I currently have effective, and the total of the two markers would be how many strength points are there. But that's not what they say, so I'm going to stick with what they're advising. So that becomes the current strength of the unit. 4 and 1 demoralized. Now, because this guy fails his morale check, he would actually have to retreat 2 hexes. And then the attacker has the option to advance after combat. Just for the heck of it, let's suppose that he actually passed his morale check. So instead of taking a permanent strength loss and retreat, he stays there with 2 demoralized strength points. That would be the conclusion of round 1. Now, since both units are still in contact, there has to be a second round. Just another fire combat resolution. So you'd figure your 2 hit, you'd figure your current strength points you can bring to bear, you would roll your dice, figure your hits, resolve your potential retreats, and then figure out whether or not you are able to conclude the combat, in place, which in the case of an attacker means they are either able to eject the defender and advance into the hex, or if they were not able to eject the defender, they actually have to retreat out of contact. They can't stay in contact with the defender by the end of the second combat round. So in effect, you get 2 chances to eject the defender from their hex each combat turn. And that would conclude an engagement. At that point, you would move on to your next engagement and so on across the board. Let's look at approach fire. Approach fire is just a special case of fire combat. The idea is that during a move turn, as units move into contact with the enemy, they're going to initiate combat, of course, in the next combat turn. So you mark them with a approach fire marker. It shows the side that is moving, and then the other side will be firing. Now, any number of approach fire markers can be placed during movement turns. One or both sides can have approach fire markers. Let's suppose that during the Confederate movement turn, this Davis moved adjacent to Paul. He'd be marked with an approach fire. Now, in the next combat turn, whichever side's turn it is, all pending approach fires will be resolved. That's because all combats will be undertaken, simultaneous fires in the normal combat. But this is a special case. This gives the side that was engaged, I hate to use that word, but the moving unit moved adjacent to the stationary unit. This unit that was stationary gets an opportunity to fire at the moving unit. And it is not simultaneous fire, it is just one fire against the moving unit. Approach fires are resolved at the first part of the combat turn after retreats and artillery bombardment. Then you have approach fire, and it's just a free fire from the stationary unit against the moving unit. So in most respects, it's resolved like a normal fire combat, except with one fire coming from the stationary unit. There is a pretty large modifier to make it hard to hit the moving unit. That's a -3. So the moving unit may not get to fire back, but at least they make themselves a hard target because they're moving. And the other difference is that after hit resolution, a failure of a morale check has the same result in terms of losses and demoralizations, but there's no retreat of the moving unit. They're fired upon, they take their losses, and then they will then enter the combat engagements in the state with whatever damage they took. So you resolve each approach fire in turn. It's not an engagement, so there's just one fire, no multiple rounds. And then each side, whoever has a approach fire marker, that is resolved.